Welcome to the October episode of International Voices. My name is Udo Fluck. I oversee the Office of Global and Cultural Affairs in Arts Missoula, and I am the host and moderator of this podcast series. To listen to episodes from earlier this year or last year, please visit artsmissoula.org, click on Global and Cultural Affairs, and visit Radio and Podcasts. International Voices is a monthly podcast brought to you through a collaboration of Global and Cultural Affairs in Arts Missoula and The Trail 1033. Today's podcast is the third and last part of a three-part series on cultures and the environment. And my guest today is Dr. Volker Rachold. He is the head of the German Arctic office at the Alfred Wegener Institute, Helmholtz Center for Polar and Marine Research, which serves as an information and cooperation platform between German stakeholders from science, politics, and industry. Before moving to the German Arctic office in 2017, he served as the executive secretary of the International Arctic Science Committee. Dr. Rachold graduated as a geochemist from Göttingen University, where he also obtained his PhD in 1994. Since then, he worked with the Alfred Wegener Institute. His research focused on land-ocean interactions in the Siberian Arctic, and he led several land and ship-based Russian-German expeditions. Volker Rachold, thank you for being my guest for the October episode of International Voices. You have been involved in the International Arctic Science Committee for the past 27 years. You have been a senior researcher at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research. How did you get started in this field?
Oh, actually, I started, I started with a PhD on climate research. So my background was always something connected to climate research. And then, of course, my education is geochemistry. So what I did is apply geochemistry to study climate. So my PhD was on climate from the Cretaceous, so extremely old climate, but still it was climate. And then it was the time when the wall came down and the two parts of Germany came together. Of course, and then there were many opportunities opening up in Eastern Germany. And I got the offer to do a postdoc in Potsdam at the Alfred Wegener Institute, also climate related. So it was on rivers in Siberia. And I mean, at that time, of course, that was in the early 90s. Going to Siberia was like going to the moon. Yeah, and I found it fascinating. And so I said yes, and I started there. And then, I just continued in the Arctic. And I just love the Arctic. So it's a fantastic place. So that's the story behind it.
Wonderful. Now, as head of the German Arctic office, you are serving as the interface between science, politics, and industry. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, the idea when we formed this German Arctic office as part of the Arctic Indigenous Institute was that we wanted to have a tool or an instrument to better communicate, particularly with policymakers, so politicians within Germany, because there is a lot of interest in Germany and the German politics on the Arctic. So for various reasons. I mean, of course, there is the Federal Foreign Office, which represents Germany on the Arctic Council. Germany is, of course, quite a large research nation in the Arctic. So the Alfred Wegener Institute, I believe, is the largest research institute for polar regions in the world. So and there is quite a bit of interest. But there are also other interests like the environment. Protecting the environment is of really high priority for Germany. But there's also, of course, some industry which is interested in working together with Arctic countries on mainly sustainable development activities in the Arctic. So that was the idea. We wanted to have a forum or an instrument to better talk to policymakers so that they have, that we have on one side, we have a tool to inform policymakers, but on the other side also to get their needs and get their questions back into the science so that the science can really address their questions.
Now, you just mentioned the indigenous people. Could you talk a little bit more about your collaboration with the Sami Council and the recently published paper on Arctic indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I had a long let's say I have a long history on working with the Arctic Council, and of course the permanent participants, that's what they are called in the Arctic Council. So the organizations that represent the indigenous peoples in the Arctic on the council, they are always sitting at the council, of course. And as permanent participants, they have a very strong say on what the Arctic Council does. So they are not members like the 8 Arctic states, but they are called permanent participants, which means there's no decision taken in the Arctic Council without asking and consulting with the indigenous peoples. So, and this is why I know many of them, because as an executive secretary of the National Arctic Science Committee, we were also observer on the Arctic Council. So I always met them at the meetings. So, and I have a long history of talking to them. So I know Sami Council since almost 20 years. I think that was also helpful in terms of producing this paper, because you need some trust, of course. You need a trustful relationship. And that takes some time to build up this trust with indigenous people. So I think that was probably the key important thing to make this really happen.
Right. As a geochemist, what impacts of anthropogenic climate change have you seen affecting Arctic nations and the 4 million people living there, particularly indigenous peoples?
I mean, we know now that the Arctic is warming much faster than the rest of the globe on average. So far, at the moment we have a global warming of about 1.2 degrees Celsius since, let's say, pre-industrial times. But in the Arctic, it's 3 times more. So in the Arctic, we were already talking about something like 3-4 degree warming. And of course, that changes many things in the Arctic. I mean, everyone sees the sea ice disappearing. Everyone sees the Greenland ice sheet starting to melt. But we also see the permafrost, especially in Siberia, but also in Alaska and in Canada, thawing. People live there. And of course, this has an impact on living conditions. We see the coasts, for example, eroding. That's a very specific thing. And of course, it affects people living there. Many people live at the coast in the Arctic. So we see, of course, vegetation changes. We see the seasons changing, and the spring starting earlier and fall starting later. Of course, that affects the people living there, and especially the indigenous peoples. I mean, they're used to adapt to changes in the Arctic, and they always tell us, of course, we know this because we live there since millennia, but still this is, of course, really a challenge for all of them. So changes that we see in the Arctic.
Now, and I would like to go off a little bit off of my questions that I have, simply because I find it fascinating. And oftentimes when I have these conversations, as the conversation takes place, there are other things that come to mind, or one wants to elaborate on a previous point. When we talk about indigenous people and their environment, it seems as though indigenous people have learned to adapt to changes in the environment for thousands of years. But this development that we have seen in the last 50 years would require a major adaptation of indigenous people. How does that work? Is this outside of their normal, typical adaptation range, would you say? Or is this something where they're saying, well, nature has always changed, and so we're flexible enough to change with it? Or is this a much more profound change we're talking about?
I think we have to see 2 things. First, of course, we see the environmental changes,
right,
which are already challenging indigenous peoples, of course. I mean, as you say, of course, they are used to adapt to changes, but changing to something which is happening so fast, it's also for them, of course, a major challenge. But the other thing is, of course, what happens in the Arctic, let's say, on the socioeconomic level. I mean, we see more and more industry coming to the Arctic. We see tourism coming to the Arctic. We see shipping in the Arctic increasing. And of course, all of this affects the people, the indigenous peoples in particular. We see, for example, also regulations affecting them. Yeah. So, I mean, of course, they are part of a country or of a state. And of course, the state introduces new regulations. For example, when they are allowed to fish, which kind of fish, at what time of the year, for example.
Right.
And that, of course, affects them. So when you talk to them, you are sometimes surprised to hear that they tell you, okay, climate change, of course, is a challenge for us, but all the other changes we are facing due to the, let's say, socioeconomic changes in the Arctic are much more difficult for us. Yeah? And that is sometimes very surprising to hear that. So it's a combination of both, I would say. Yeah?
Right. And I would think that that the change in wildlife, or the push of wildlife from certain areas into other areas, must be a big adjustment as well, as far as food sources and cultural practices of using certain products such as fur and other products that the Sami have used for generations to sustain their living. I mean, those kind of things, I'm sure, are a profound impact as well when your food sources disappear.
Yeah, I think the way they live, of course, they live with the nature. They are used to, we live together with the nature. They are not dominating the nature, they live with the nature. And for example, when you ask them about especially the reindeer herders, they would tell you, we follow the reindeer. So it's the reindeer's life cycle that tells us how to move in the Arctic. So, and of course, these cycles are changed through environmental changes. Yeah. So the reindeers have difficulties with finding the right places for grazing, and of course this is important for the people as well. So and all the indigenous knowledge that they developed over millennia, which tells them how to behave and what to do, it doesn't really work anymore because things change, and that is of course a big issue for them.
What type of progress have you seen in terms of dialogue between scientists and politicians integrating indigenous knowledge, the knowledge we just talked about, when it comes to shifting to sustainable development over the exploitation of the Arctic for economic interests such as shipping, oil and gas, exploration, fishing, and even tourism?
I think very important, body in the Arctic is the Arctic Council, and of course the Arctic Council is an instrument, and it's a forum that the indigenous peoples, as I explained, as participants, are using since 25 years now. So this year the Arctic Council has its 25th anniversary, and I think the Arctic Council has been very supportive, and especially over the last few years, the integration of indigenous knowledge has become more and more important in the council. So, and the Arctic Council has 6 working groups, which are, let's say, the scientific instruments of the council. So providing the advice that the ministers, which are, let's say, heading the council, that they need. And all these working groups are now trying to integrate indigenous knowledge. So they're working together with the permanent participants so that all the scientific activities are informed also by indigenous knowledge and developed together. This is in the Arctic Council. I think this works already quite well. I mean, of course, if you talk about science from especially other countries like in Germany, I think we are just starting to realize how important that is.
Right.
And especially for natural sciences, it's sometimes difficult to understand how this can help, let's say, in a scientific context. But I think people are more and more realizing that this is so important because the indigenous knowledge is exactly what guarantees the sustainable activity that the indigenous peoples are, because they are absolutely sustainable. They live with nature. And so this is an ideal model of being sustainable, you can say.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. And again, going a little bit off of my script, we have 7 Native American tribes in Montana. And I work with Native American educators every so often. And it's interesting to just appreciate the angle or the lens that indigenous people have when it comes to sustainability of anything. I find this fascinating compared to non-indigenous people, that there is this, like you said, there is this connection to nature. There is this, like you said, for the Sami, we follow the reindeer. We just sort of see what the reindeer do, and then we'll just go with that and everything will be fine. And it's the same here when you talk to indigenous individuals. There is this guidance in nature, or this guidance or this trust in nature even, that is hard to find and perhaps would be nice to see in non-Indigenous people, a little bit closer, paying attention to nature and what nature is telling humans. I mean, just as a side note, when you were talking, it's sort of interesting that Indigenous people, no matter where they are, seem to follow that kind of an approach much more so than non-Indigenous people. Moving a little bit from our conversation that was so far Arctic specific to how the rest of the world is impacted by climate change. Are the extreme weather events that we have witnessed this spring and summer, and particularly in the United States with hurricanes and floods, particularly the devastating rainfall in New York recently with pictures of flooded subways, and is that connected to climate change?
We had similar things here in Germany. You probably saw that we also had floodings here just a few weeks before. It's of course difficult to attribute one specific event to climate change, as you know.
Right.
You cannot do that. But what scientists are telling us, and the last IPCC report that came out just a few weeks ago was very clear on that. What we know is that the frequency and the intensities of these extreme events is something that is driven by climate change. So we have to expect those things more and more. They become more frequent and they become intense and they intensify. And that is something which is clearly connected to climate change. And it's pretty easy to explain it, because if you have a warmer atmosphere, you have more moisture in the atmosphere and you can have more rainfall. So it's a very simple story at the end. And that is something that scientists are telling us since 20 years.
Right.
It's nothing new. So, but I think we now start really to see those kind of things getting more and more intense and more frequent. So it is something that we will have to expect even more in the future. So it's not unusual, though of course you cannot attribute one single event specifically to climate change. That's a different story.
But you're right when you're saying that there's now more proof, perhaps, for the doubters that were always wondering if climate change is a real thing. When you see a flooded subway or flooded streets that haven't been flooded in the last 100 years, one has to wonder if this is the proof of what was predicted. Although, and on that same note, I remember seeing earlier models of climate change that were based on data 30, 40 years ago. It seems as though perhaps some of these models have been adjusted, as in there must have been some progress made and there must have been some positive influence that scientists have noticed that sort of improved the modeling perhaps a little bit. Would you agree with that?
Of course they did. I mean, the computer technology is very important. I mean, running these kind of models requires really huge computers, very powerful computers. And of course, there has been some progress made over the last years in these computers. And also the data that are feeding the models, of course. And that's the thing we're working on. So we need better observations to feed our models. Of course, that's also much better than it used to be, let's say, 20 years ago. But at the end, it's interesting to see that when we look at reports that came out 15 years ago, the overall picture was quite similar. So it didn't change the direction. I think it made things just clearer. And I mean, the IPCC for the first time said that there's no doubt that this is man-made climate change. And before that, the IPCC reports were always quite careful with saying we have 90% or we have 90% confidence. This time, for the first time, they said there is no doubt. It is clear. It's obvious. Wow. And I mean, this year was an unusual year. So we had, you mentioned the floods, but we also at the same time we had the wildfires in the US. In Siberia was on fire. We had for the first time, and that was never recorded, we had rainfall on the summit in Greenland, which is on the Greenland ice sheet, elevation of 3,000 meters, 3 kilometers, and there was rainfall. And that was never observed so far. Last year, for the first time, we had something like 22 degrees Celsius in Svalbard, Spitsbergen, which is very close to the North Pole. Yeah?
Right.
So especially in the Arctic, we are seeing these extremes more and more frequent. Yeah, simply because the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the globe.
Right. Yeah, it connects well to the podcast I did last month, where I talked to an NPR reporter that has specialized in wildfires. And he was talking about the fact that the previous year, the fires in Australia, parts of Australia burned that have never burned before. And scientists were just shocked by the fact that some of these rainforests in Australia that typically don't burn or can't burn were actually on fire. And he said the same thing, that because this year and last year were the hottest years on record, that we're moving into a very interesting phase where things are observed for the first time that never happened before. So probably what he observed in Australia is similar to what you just said with the temperature spikes in the Arctic that has never been 22 degrees. And so some of this may just almost be entering a new phase, perhaps. Would that be appropriate to say?
Yeah, I think we are now seeing those things that have been predicted since many years already. We're seeing those things happening now. And
right.
We see these extreme events. We had, for example, the highest temperature ever recorded in Europe this year. In Italy, it was something like close to 50 degrees. And there was this in Canada. This was in the summer, I think, in Canada, Canada, north of Vancouver. They had almost 50 degrees, I think, 47 or something like that.
Yeah.
Highest temperature ever recorded there. And I mean, it is pretty obvious that it's not one single event. So it's spread around the globe, and it's
right.
a number of events.
Right.
It's different things. So it's rainfalls, it's forest fires, it's just temperature spikes. So, but more and more frequent and more intense. And I think this is pretty obvious that this is happening.
Yeah, even us here in Missoula is 1,600 meters in elevation. So we normally have a mountain climate. And this summer, and in the past, I've lived here for 30 years. So in the past, when we had 2 or 3 days in the summer that were over 100 degrees, over 40 degrees Celsius, it was remarkable if we had 3 days. This summer, I stopped counting at some point, because we had weeks where it was 4 days, 5 days over 100 degrees. And it was just sort of a new normal. And, it impacts what you do with your, water rationing. There were several places that basically told people, stop watering your lawn and stop watering your flowers because there isn't enough water for people to drink. So forget about your lawn. If your lawn dries up, well, so be it. So there were some completely new directions that people were given that were unheard of, especially in Montana, where you have mountainous climate. So even for us, this was something that we felt right here was unusual and certainly concerning. Along the same lines, are you worried that as ice loss continues to speed up in both Greenland and Antarctica, parts of the ice sheets could eventually destabilize and collapse entirely? What would that mean for sea level rises around the world?
That is one of the, let's say, biggest concerns that we have in terms of the changing Arctic or the warming Arctic, but also the Antarctic, as to say. If you look at the figures, if you take Greenland, the Greenland ice sheet, if that completely disappeared, it would result in 6-7 meter sea level rise globally. 6 to 7 meters. Of course, it won't disappear within 2 or 5 years, or not even 100 years, it will take longer, but the potential is there, 6-7 meters. And then if you look at the Antarctic, so if the Antarctic ice sheet disappears, or if it thaws, if it melts, that would be 60 meters of sea level. So in total, Greenland and Antarctic would be 70 meters of sea level. I'm also a geologist, and of course we had that during geological past. There were phases in the past where we had no ice and where sea level was 70 meters higher than today. Of course,
Right.
we say geological timescales, which means millions of years, of course.
Right.
But what we are seeing now things happening that this melting of Greenland, that this goes within years or decades. And I think the last IPCC was also very clear on that this is, of course, a big concern for us. So far it was mainly the warming of the ocean that resulted in sea level rise. You can imagine if the ocean gets warmer, the water gets warmer, it expands, and so the sea level is rising. That was the main reason for rising sea level. But now, since years already, it's the contribution of the ice that's melting. I mean, if you have ice sitting on land and the ice melts, of course, the water flows into the ocean and the sea level rises. And that's now the main factor in sea level rise. And what the IPCC expects until the end of this century, so within the next 80 years, is a sea level increase between 0.5 meter and 1 meter, which doesn't sound much, but for some countries it is. I mean, take the Netherlands, for example, take the island states, so the Netherlands, for example, they're gone. You know?
Right.
If it's 1 meter, and that's a pretty, I would say, conservative value, as the IPCC also said. So it could be more.
Right.
And this time, for the first time, the IPCC ran the models until 2300, so another 200 years. And then they said, okay, if we do that, we cannot even rule out that this is a 15-meter sea level rise by 2300. So that is not very likely, but we cannot rule it out. Yeah? So we are talking about meters of sea levels, right. And that is, of course, something we should be worried about, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And even people that are not living in coastal regions that might initially react as in, so a little rise of sea level doesn't impact me. I live 200 miles away from the coast. But I think the scenario that you just described, it would impact pretty much everybody, no matter where you live. And so I think this attitude of, it's not happening in my backyard, so to say, doesn't work anymore because it's everybody's backyard all of a sudden.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget, of course, I mean, a major portion of the population of the globe lives at the coast.
Right.
And of course, if they all start moving away and they all become refugees, I mean, we are talking about a number of refugees that we cannot imagine. And of course, then you are right. Of course, it will affect everyone, no matter where you live. Yeah.
And this is an interesting term you just mentioned, climate refugees. From the things that I read until 20 years ago, when I think the first sort of climate refugees, or not even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, were mentioned. Before that, there wasn't even a term. Nobody had ever used the term a climate refugee, a person that is displaced from their natural habitat to a new location because of climate. But this is obviously now something that we see quite often around the world already, is that people have moved away from areas where they used to live and where they used to have some kind of a livelihood to areas where they themselves are strangers and are not familiar in their environment anymore. So that's obviously something that could become a much bigger issue if things progress in the way that you have described them with the modeling that is out there. Somewhat a wake-up call, again, for those people that have doubted that this is much of an impact for the general population, perhaps.
Yeah, but we should possibly not be too pessimistic about it. I mean, there's always, what the IPCC does, the IPCC calculates different emission scenarios.
Right.
So they always use say business as usual. We just continue as we did before scenario, which is of course the worst. Right. But then they also have one which is, let's say, the Paris Climate Agreement 1.5 degree aim. Yeah. And if you compare the two scenarios, of course, the outcome is very different. And then, of course, the whole story doesn't sound so dramatic. And instead of, let's say, 1 meter by the end of the century, it's only 0.5 meter. Yeah. Right. That is already a big difference. And that relates to everything. So to all the things we see. So it's still in our hands. So we can still do something about it. And that's, I think, a very important message. So
absolutely.
But we have to do it now. That's the point.
Right.
We cannot wait another 20 years. That doesn't work. No?
Right. Now, that would bring me to the next question. What can we learn from the indigenous peoples in the Northern Hemisphere? What have you observed through your interactions with them? And how can we be more respectful of our environment and coexist with our ecosystems?
I mean, of course, we talked about that they live with nature. And this is probably the most sustainable way of living
right.
that you can do. But I mean, of course, then the question is, would it be possible for 10 billion people living on this globe to live this kind of a life? We don't have that nature. So I think we don't have enough nature for doing it. So, I mean, of course, we can learn from that, but it's possibly not a model that you could simply use for the whole population of the globe. It simply doesn't work. So we can take some elements maybe from that, some elements that are useful, for example, in terms of agriculture. I mean, we have agriculture in our countries is industrial production, completely industrial production. And of course, this is, first of all, the products are not very good. Yeah? And secondly, of course, it has so many consequences and so many negative effects for the environment. That of course this is not ideal. So maybe we can learn from indigenous peoples on how they get their products and how they get their livelihood from nature. I think there is something we can take from it, though I think it's probably not possible for the whole population of the globe to live this kind of indigenous life. That doesn't work. So we have to be realistic.
Right. What are some recent events and projects you have been planning and implementing that you could tell us about?
I think the largest project that my institute did last year was the so-called Mosaic expedition. I guess some people heard about it. It was the largest polar expedition ever that used our icebreaker Polarstern, sitting in the Central Arctic Ocean for 1 full year, frozen in the ice and drifting with the sea ice over the Arctic Ocean with hundreds of scientists on board and studying, let's say, the whole system in the Arctic during 1 full year. So from autumn 2000, no, they started in 2019 and then the expedition went until autumn 2020. So 1 full year on board of a research icebreaker, frozen in the Arctic Ocean. And that was a huge expedition. And of course, we hope to understand much more, especially on what the role of the sea ice in the climate system. So one thing that we start to realize and start to understand is that the sea ice is an extremely important element in the climate system. Because it's, for example, what we are talking about, these heat waves we experience in North America or in Europe. Right. Also these cold events that you had in North America in, let's say, spring, March or something like that. Right. These colds, both the cold and the hot events in summer are connected to the sea ice because the sea ice triggers also the atmospheric circulation patterns. It's mainly the jet stream, which moves around the globe, right. Which is kind of responsible for our climate. And if you have a weaker sea ice and smaller sea ice cover in the Arctic, this jet stream pattern is changing. And the jet stream starts to kind of meander, so move up and down. Right. And that brings either cold air from the north to the south, or it brings warm air from the south more to the north. So, and that is something which directly affects our climate in North America and in Europe and also in Asia. And it is made in the Arctic because the sea ice is kind of the driving force behind it. Sure. Now, and that was the reasons for doing this expedition 1 year around, and especially from the winter season, we don't have really data. We don't know what's happening in the Arctic in winter. It's so difficult to get there. Right. So, and that was the reason for that. So that makes me think then what you just said about the ice directly impacting jet streams. Would that also apply for underwater currents? Are they impacted by that as well? That is another story where scientists are really working on hard, I think, already since years. because at the end, of course, let's say the climate engine of our globe is the ocean.
Right.
So the ocean, and it's driven in the Arctic. It's driven, or in the North Atlantic Arctic, and it's driven by very cold and dense water sinking to the ocean floor.
Right.
And then moving southward through the Atlantic Ocean and until the Pacific Ocean, coming up again, and then moving backwards as surface current. And this is kind of the engine that transports heat over the globe.
Right.
And it's triggered mainly by sea ice formation. Because if you form sea ice, you leave. Of course, sea ice is fresh water. Yeah? So the salt stays in the water. So when you form sea ice, you produce the rest water is very salty, it's very cold, and that makes it very dense. So this sea ice formation, of course, is actually the driving mechanism or the engine behind this ocean circulation. Right. And of course, we are worried if we change things in the system that this ocean circulation doesn't really work anymore. Which, for example, would mean that the Gulf Stream, which makes Europe so warm and mild, and Norway, for example, so mild, if that doesn't work anymore, we have a problem. And so this is, again, why the Arctic is so important. The same is with melting Greenland. If you melt Greenland ice sheet, of course, it's fresh water because it's from snow. You introduce more fresh water, huge amounts of fresh water into this area, the same area where this engine of the ocean circulations is sitting. And of course, the fresh water would also result in lowering this driving force and resulting in changes in this ocean circulation. So this is another mechanism which is really important. Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about this because obviously it's not something that I have a lot of knowledge in, and just listening to you and putting the pieces together, it seems then that the melting of ice sheets could not be only influenced by higher temperatures and therefore warmer air, but they could also melt from underneath. So is that right, or am I?
Exactly, it's exactly right. And that's what we see. So, I mean, of course, if you look at the Greenland ice sheet, also on the Antarctic, it's the same there. Of course, you have, the first thing is, of course, atmospheric temperature, which results in surface melting of the ice sheet. Yeah, this is pretty straightforward. But then, of course, if you have warmer ocean water, and in some cases, the water is directly connected to the glacier. Right. In Greenland, there are also glaciers which end on land. Then it's no issue, of course, because then there's no direct link. Right. But especially in the Antarctic, of course, the glacier or the ice sheet of the Antarctic is, let's say, reaching out into the ocean. And then, of course, you have warm ocean water underneath the ice. And that, of course, results in thawing of the ice. So then it's a pretty complex mechanism, but of course it's important. Yeah.
But you're almost getting a double impact then in that mechanism, because not only are you unfortunately melting the ice on top, but you're also melting the ice from underneath, which seems to be twice as bad, for lack of a better description, than if you would have to deal with just one of those issues.
Yeah, it's an important factor that, of course, results in melting of the ice sheets. Yeah.
Now, this long-term study of, if one can call this 1 year of an icebreaker a long-term study, but it's longer than many studies that are just specifically doing one thing in a short period of time. Are there other projects like this that you are planning on for the future? That would look at observing impacts on longer time spans, like several months or a year?
We just started a few weeks ago. We started a pretty large European-funded project, which with the aim of establishing and implementing an Arctic observing system. As I said, if we want to model things, if we want to have better prediction of things, we need data. We need observations. Right. And it's a huge project. It's a European Union funded project, which involves, 30 30, 40 different institutes from Europe, with, of course, North American partners and with Asian partners as well. And that is a 4-year project. Total is something like 50 million euro. So it's quite a bit of money. So and that looks into different components of such an observing system. So what kind of data you need, how do you get the data, how do you work with the data, how do you communicate with people? Also in terms of indigenous knowledge, that's of course an important contribution to their project.
Right.
That just started. So, and we will see how far we get in 4 years.
Sure.
But I think we need those kind of larger projects, integrating things on a global, circum-Arctic level, because this is the baseline that we need for the data basis we need for our models, for our prediction.
Right. So. Right. Well, that would bring me to my last question, and that is, from your perspective, how can everybody help in this quest of climate change? How can the average person? Because I think it's that is perhaps part of the problem, that a lot of people say, well, what could I possibly do? I live this little existence here with my family, and we recycle our glass and our aluminum cans and whatnot, and we try to be good global citizens. What could we possibly do? That kind of an attitude. And so I thought I ask you that in closing for today. What are there some things that our listeners could say, oh, I didn't know that's something easy that I could actually do and improve the situation? What would that be?
I think everyone can do something. And of course, it's not the same thing applies for everyone, but I mean, there are many, many things where you can start. So for example, take your food. Of course, if you buy organic food and if you eat less meat, if you try to reduce your meat consumption, only, let's say, meat every second day or once a week. Yeah? The thing is, of course, it's always difficult to tell people you are not allowed to do that.
Right.
People, the first thing is, I think, to understand that you do something for your nature, for everyone, but you also do something for yourself. I mean, eating less meat is also good for your health. Yeah. So for example, we try to do that. Eat less meat. Yeah. The other thing, of course, if you have a car, for each time you take the car, you can just think, could I just take the bicycle, for example, or maybe walk or whatever? Do I need to take the car? Yeah.
Right.
So, for example, I cycle to my office every day. I don't even take a car to the office. I mean, of course, it's not a long distance, but it works. Yeah.
Sure.
Flying is a big thing. So, I mean, if you fly, of course, sometimes you have to fly. It's not avoidable, and you have to fly.
Right.
But I think we learned a lot from the pandemics with all the video conferences we learned. I think that's also what the scientists have learned, that many things can be organized through a video conference, and you don't even have to fly. So I think and flying is, of course, a huge emission.
Sure.
We know that. Yeah? And if you have to fly, you can still compensate. I mean, at least it's something. Yeah, you can compensate for your flight. That's one thing. Your house, heating of the house, isolation of the house, and those kind of things. You can do a lot. Yeah, with let's say if you need a new heating system, buy a heat pump. Yeah? Don't take gas or oil or whatever. Buy a heat pump. It does a lot. I think, yeah. And so there are many, many examples and many things that you can do without, let's say, starving or without missing something really important. I think that's the key message. Nobody should starve or whatever.
Sure.
But it's not so difficult, actually.
Right. And the fact that it applies to everybody, and it's not that this only is advice for a certain part of the population, but that, like you said, that everybody can make a difference with just being more conscious about what we do and how we do it. So I think that's excellent advice. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight into the topic. I really appreciate that. And Yes, I learned a lot from just listening to you and thinking about some of these things and making some connections in my own head as I was unaware of some of these things. So I'm sure that our listeners will find the same. And so thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Dr. Volker Rachold, head of the German Arctic office at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Potsdam, Germany, for his time and for sharing his experience in the field. This was the third part of a 3-part series focusing on cultures and the environment. Before I sign off, I would like the listeners to know that the Worldview film series is back at the Roxy this fall with the theme Cultures in Flux. And the award-winning animated film, The Breadwinner, will be shown on Monday, October 11th at 7 p.m. The film is sponsored by Rydek Law Offices in Missoula and is free to the Missoula community. There are 2 more screenings scheduled for this fall, all free to the public because of generous sponsors near and far. 2 things that are new this fall: following each film, Marisa Diaz-Wayne from Merlin CCC in Helena will facilitate a community conversation inspired by questions raised in the movie. The conversations have the aim of creating a space for thoughtful dialogue, reflection, and sharing. Every person through the door at each Worldview film night receives a raffle ticket for a dinner for 2 at a Missoula restaurant. The winners of the raffle prizes will be announced at the end of the community conversation. To the listeners near and far, please join me again next month for a new episode of International Voices. As always, thank you for listening. Those of you who are regularly tuning in to International Voices know, being of German descent, I usually end with a German farewell. Dankeschön fürs Zuhören. International Voices is brought to you by Global and Cultural Affairs of Arts Missoula and The Trail 1033. This and previous International Voices podcasts can be found at artsmissoula.org and thetrail1033.com.